Good evening. We're at Psalm 4. If you want to go ahead and turn to Psalm 4. We talked last week, a couple of weeks ago, as we started in the Psalms, about the different types of Psalms, and we talked about wisdom Psalms, royal Psalms that talk about the kingship, the God being king. They're called royal Psalms. We talked about laments. There are those that are individual laments, like the writer is lamenting his own condition. And then there are congregational laments that he's writing a lamentation for, like, the whole nation of Israel or the congregation of Israel, however you want to put that. Several different kinds of psalms. And I ask you what Psalm 4 would be, what it would fit in. We talked about Psalm 1 being a psalm of wisdom. Psalm 3 is a lamentation, and Psalm 5 is a lamentation, but it's kind of unclear what Psalm 4 is. So I ask you to read that and come back with that thought, that idea of what you thought Psalm 4, what kind of psalm it is. Now, one of the things I wanted you to remember is that sometimes a psalm will fit into many different categories. It doesn't have to necessarily only be a lamentation. It can also be a psalm of wisdom, or it could be a psalm of talking about the royalness of God, the kingship of God. But it could also be something else. It could be a psalm of wisdom. Here's what happens, and we'll look at this later. Oftentimes a lamentation will open up with woe is me and poor old me and life is awful and my enemies are after me and I can't believe God would forsake me. And then it will end with, oh, God is great and how wonderful is the King Almighty. So you see what that is? That's begins as a lamentation and ends with a declaration of the royal nature of God and the mightiness of God and so forth. One of the categories I didn't talk about last week was this whole section of Psalms that would be used in the in the New Testament. There are a collection of, I think, about 12 or something like that, Psalms that are quoted, or a portion of them are used in the New Testament. So those are significant as well for Jesus or for one of the New Testament writers to pull from the Psalms of the Old Testament and bring them forward into the New Testament. That's very significant as well. Also, one of the things we need to remember is that the Psalms are hymns. They are oftentimes poetry that's put to music, and they are sung in many different occasions. Some of them sung on the way to the temple, some sung at the temple, some sung on the way back from the temple. Some are individual mourning, mourning, mourning psalms, where you would mourn, where you would read that and you would sing that as a mourning song, a psalm. That whole idea of it being something that is sung, that's not new. That's not something that we've only come up with in the 19th century in America, to sing our heart, the blues. That's not something that we've just come up with. The psalmist did that, and the Israelites did that as well. So it was something that was very significant in the time of the Hebrews. So what I was getting at is these are songs, they're hymns, they are sung, they are poetry put to music, and they are not necessarily meant to be essays on a certain topic. The psalmist, as poetry and the poetry of the Old Testament, has one view, one thought, one idea, and that is to paint a picture. to give you the ability to, in your mind, see a picture of what is being described. Whether it's the lamentation of David as he mourns his sin, and there's this flow to that David would mourn that sin and desire relationship with God to be restored, and whatever it takes, however it goes, I want my relationship with you. And David uses flowery language to paint this picture as he talks about paint me or cleanse me with hyssop. That's a flowery use of language, where we might simply say, make me clean. He uses that verbiage of that would paint this picture. So we need to remember that. They're not necessarily meant to be essays as you read from verse 1 to the end, last verse in it. Oftentimes it's just that writer painting that very vivid picture with poetry. So let's go back to Psalm 4. And as you begin, this psalm appears to be something of a lamentation. Did anybody catch that as you read it? I think maybe that was mentioned last time. It is when you look at Psalm 4, it seems that it's kind of a dirge. It's kind of a difficulty. The psalm begins with a cry for help. As a matter of fact, there's a threefold cry for help. By the way, that's one of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry is they will group things in groups of threes or six or seven or whatever. There'll be groups of those. So there's this group of three cries, or there's this cry for help. And then it is punctuated at the end, as I mentioned before, it's punctuated at the end with an understanding of the fact that there is assurance of being delivered. So let's read it. Just read it all the way through. It's short, and I'll read it all the way through, reading from the English Standard Version. Answer me when I call, O God, of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You've put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. What kind of psalm do you think that is? What's the major theme? What's the thing that stands out to you when I read that? What is it that kind of hits you in the face when you read Psalm 4? Okay, so the person who lives the right kind of life is going to have a completely different outlook, a completely different heart, completely different feeling than those who are the unrighteous. Okay? What else do you see there that would help us define the movement of this psalm and what the psalmist is communicating as he... So it's ascribed to David, you might see maybe in your notes, and some believe that he wrote Psalm 3 and 4, maybe at different times, but the Hebrews used Psalm 3 and 4 together oftentimes. Anything else you see there? Comfort, all right. One of the things that he's crying out for is comfort. He's seeking that very thing. Okay. From David's observation, he sees that some people are not going to call on God. They're not going to revere Him and hold Him in high esteem, and they're going to keep doing what they want to do. Yes. Yes. That originally in that cry for help, in that the first part of those verses of chapter 4, he is looking for relief. So that would be a lament, wouldn't it? There would be lamentation there in those first few verses, or in parts of those verses. One of the things you'll note about Psalms and the way that they are often written is you'll have this contrast. The first part of the verse may give you a statement that is a positive statement. Then the second part of that may be a negative statement. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. So the verse 1, all of that saying basically the same thing in three different lines. And then he says in verse 2, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? And there's that cry for help beginning there in verse 2. Well, one of the things that we know because of human nature is that if you look at these as works of the heart, and I think that's really what poetry is, works of the heart, you're exactly right. I think when David writes the ones that he writes, I don't remember how many is ascribed to him, I think about 80 or something like that. The rest of them we're not sure about, but when David writes, he's filling his heart. And sometimes it's brutally honest because he will question God and ask all these questions. But then usually at the end of the psalm, after he's lamented and poured out that heart of grief and pain and struggle, oftentimes he'll come back to this and he'll say, just as he said here in the last verse, in peace I'll lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Well, what did he do in the first? In the first, he said, where are you? I need you. I'm in need of help. And then the last verse is, well, I know where to turn. There you are. Yeah. Okay, so the Psalm's basic message, I think, is summed up in verse 8. As I mentioned there in London's comment, from verse 8, you kind of see the summation of this. So it is a psalm of praise, isn't it? It's a psalm that David takes opportunity to say, I know who you are. I am aware of the one to whom I can turn. And I realize there's no one else to whom I can turn. So I think the message of this could be in verse 7, but verse 8. But verse 7 is also connected to that because he says, he's talking about God, have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. So the contrast there is this affirmation that there's one place to find true joy or true happiness. The thing that's characteristic of the harvest is what? You got to do it again next year, don't you? Right? If you're raised on a farm or if you're a farmer, you know what you got to do. As soon as the crop comes in, you got to get started for the next crop. You get it in, you put it up, you lay by, you do whatever is necessary, then you got to start all over. So the contrast is, you, God, bring me that joy that is true joy and true content, because when it comes to the things of this world, they are temporary. They do not fully fulfill or totally satisfy. Because think about it. I don't know if you already had dinner or supper, whatever you call it, but if you sat down to that meal tonight, you were full and satisfied, or at least I hope you were. If you haven't yet, I hope you are when you get up from the table, that you'll be full and satisfied. But what will you do tomorrow? You'll still have to do the same thing. You'll have to sit down at the table or... Right, it's not lasting. And I think that's what he's saying there in verse 7. This joy that you put in my heart is lasting. The grain, the wine, the harvest, all those things that we harp on, put so much focus on, they are temporary. So the attitude, as Tomello brought out, there's this attitude of many, and there's this attitude of David, and there's this confirmation of the place that God holds in the life of His people. The greatness of God, the contentment that He brings, the joy that He brings, and there's this kind of thread that runs through this that really highlights the idea that God is great, God is provider, God brings joy. There's all of that that's stated there. In verse 1, I think it's interesting. Some of you would appreciate that because you have given me relief. That word relief, I'm not sure what it is in some other translations, but in the second part of verse 1, he says, you've given me relief when I was in distress. The original Hebrew there is a military term that really gives the idea of you have given me room, you've given me space, which really communicates from David's point of view, God, what you have done is moved my enemies away. You've moved them away. You've given me space or room. The word relief there really communicates that. So that military term and that military idea describes one whose foes are, what do you call that? When they're about to capture you, when they're hemming you in from all sides, and your enemy is just about to capture you. And David says, God, many times in my life, you have given me room, or you've given me space. You push my enemies back. So the center of the problem seems to be, as he describes it in verse 2, because he uses the phrase, O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? So he's addressing, okay, who is he addressing when he says, O men? Who's he addressing? It does seem like that, and it seems that when he says, "Oh, men," there may be a little hint of those that are in control or those that are in charge from the original. So if he is saying, you guys that are in charge, you are messing up. You are leading the people down the wrong path. You have not done the right thing. As Ryan says, when you move on down further, there's some hint to, remember when he says offer right sacrifices? Remember we've studied for quite a while in here about the idolatry and the things that went on with the nation of Israel. And as he writes this, there may be this hint of David saying, hey, you guys that are in charge, you are not leading the people as you ought to be leading them. And the hint there to the idolatry that Ryan speaks of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, that's why I believe that when he says, oh, men, I think he's talking to those that are in charge, some officials, some in high places. But that could be true generally of mankind, couldn't it? Sometimes that word is used simply to refer to mankind. As a matter of fact, you'll see it in some of the Psalms. It may be even translated, "O mankind." But in some cases, it does have that connotation. And when in verse 2 it says that there are those who love vain words and seek after the lying words, that could easily be the leaders, or it could be just all of us, all of man.
On the number 5, it says offer right sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
There were certain rules they had to go by, and so I think that pertains to that. A lot of them later on they gave their sick animals, and they said were for sacrifices, and didn't follow the rules that God had made for animal sacrifice.
That's exactly right, and that would be not just on the leaders. We kind of had that conversation when we looked at Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, that the leaders take responsibility for taking those lame and sick animals and offering them as sacrifices, but it's still on the people too. The people bring those sacrifices. The priest accepts those sacrifices. The priest offers them to God, and the claims of the prophets is against the people. You're offering your lame, you're offering your sick. And so here it might be that very idea. A phrase that we hear because it's in the New Testament is in verse 4, be angry and do not sin. Something I read talked about when you are provoked. When we are provoked, what results? Anger. So what David is saying is, even though you've been provoked, even though there may be those who are mistreating you, it might be that you look at that and you say, well, I deserve to be angry. Well, you might deserve to be angry, but he says, be angry even when you're provoked, even when you're not at fault, and do not sin. That's the bottom line, isn't it? It doesn't matter why you are angry. We talk about sometimes when Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple courts, about that being a righteous anger. Well, a righteous anger is not when somebody provokes you and you lash out at them and throw a brick through the window. That's not righteous anger. He's saying when you're agitated, when somebody does you wrong, when you didn't do anything at all to provoke it, and they do you wrong, don't you sin. They've already sinned because they did you wrong. Don't turn around and sin yourself. Boy, isn't David a good one to talk about that? I mean, he's really a good one to really hold that emotion in, isn't he? Okay, so I think as we look at that, Psalm 4 is pretty well summed up. It speaks of all the blessings, the fact that God hears, the fact that God favors His people, the fact that God is available, that He is eager to be the God of the people. It also speaks of the fact that He is a God of peace, He's a God of safety, that He is the one in which the follower of God can find true joy, true contentment, true happiness. And I think you flip that over to application, and that's true for us as New Testament Christians, isn't it? The very same idea that this is speaking of, as David writes this psalm, however many thousands of years ago, David writes this psalm, and he's highlighting the idea that God delivers, God hears our prayer, God is available, God is concerned, God is a God of joy, peace. He's the God where we find safety. How much more fully should we understand that than David did back then? I really think the burden is heavier on us as we stand here in 2022 to realize this, put that into practice, and make it part of who we are, to be able to preach that and live that and believe that with all of our heart, even more than David did when he wrote Psalm 4. All right, any other observations about Psalm 4? Uh, what does my version say? Well, the whole thing, verse 4, be angry, do not sin, ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent.
Yeah, so you keep talking about like when you're trying to go to bed at night and you're fighting with yourself. Is that you think the correlation there?
Yeah, I think it's connected to the be angry and do not sin. You think it through and you do what's right. And I really think that what he's saying there is ponder it in your own beds and be silent, that's the opportunity to turn it over to God. Mm-hmm.
So obviously something bad happened. When you go down in verse 7, he says, you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine are bound. So is the grain and wine not abounding?
It's very likely that that's a time of God's judgment being upon Israel, and one of the reasons that David would cry out in such a way that we got to get this thing right because God's blessings have been removed from us. Yeah, that was very astute of you to pick up on that. Oh, Kelly told you.
Go back to anger.
Mm-hmm.
When Christ went into the temple, and they were still cutting games, selling stuff, and selling, you think he got angry?
Seems like it, yeah.
He turned over some tables.
Yes.
So sometimes you have to express your feelings.
Oh, exactly. Yes, and that's why I compared that. Sometimes we talk about that being a righteous anger, meaning that it was appropriate to demonstrate that. Well, David says there are some times when you are agitated and you are moved to anger when you're mistreated. As a matter of fact, really what it says, when you're mistreated, don't let that mistreatment move you to do some sin too. That's really what he's saying.
Ephesians 4:26, I believe it mentions about don't let the sun set on you.
Exactly. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath. Mm-hmm. Yes. He's not saying don't let it make you angry, but he is saying handle it, deal with it, respond appropriately, and sometimes that's going to mean that you have to deal with it between you and God on your bed. Yeah. Okay, let's look at Psalm 5. The connection is not as clear, but there is a connection between Psalm 4 and Psalm 5, because in Psalm 5 there are really 5 alternating sections. There are 12 verses, and those sections kind of alternate every couple of verses, the first 3 verses, and then 2 and 2 and so forth. Then there's this description of how evil is so real and how God hates wickedness, and it's characterized, these petitions that David makes as he writes Psalm 5, calling on them to rejoice in the God of righteousness and the affirmation of the blessings that this God provides. And so let's just look at these first 3 verses, because in those first 3 verses you have this petition that David presents to God, and notice the emotion and the action that's here in these first 3 verses. David says, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you I do pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch." Now that's a powerful introduction, because what David is doing in those introductory moments as he describes what's taking place in his life, in his heart, there are these actions that are going on, the intensity of his petition. He uses words, groaning, the sound of my cry, and I pray. In the morning you hear my voice, and in the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. Well, that's a power-packed first 3 verses of this Psalm 5. It is, to me, it is one of those things. By the way, you find this in some of the other Psalms. I didn't make a list of those. I'm not sure I could even think of one right offhand. But you find some of this kind of use of the action words. Those are verbs. You find this use of the implication of how things are acted out, and the emotion that is packed in these psalms, and that's highlighted there, I think, in those first 3 verses as he implores God to hear. You see that? Now, does David think God doesn't hear? No, he doesn't think God doesn't hear. So why does he implore God so strongly and use such words of emotion for God to hear his prayer? Why does he do that? Oh yeah, he's in distress of some kind. Life is falling apart. Things have gone wrong. Whatever it might be, and as he comes before God, he gives this strong urge. God, listen to me. Why else would he?
The key words in this are and watch.
And what? Yeah.
I mean, he should sit back and say, okay, I've prayed, I've poured out my heart to you. Now I'm going to watch and see what happens.
Yeah. Good. Why else would he implore God to hear him, to listen? Why would he implore God to do that? Over and over. I mean, he doesn't just begin like he does some of his Psalms, oh God, please listen to my prayers. I mean, he really drives it home, doesn't he? Why does he do that? Yeah, he has no hope anywhere else. He can't pick up the phone. He can't text somebody and say, hey, I'm having trouble over here. Will you buddies come over here and help me? He doesn't have anybody to call on. When you are king, the buck stops with the king. Where's the king going to go? He only has one place to go. Yeah, isn't it interesting that when you have these lamentations, sometimes when we're reading them from our perspective, we say, man, David doesn't have much faith in God. But as Tommy says, really it's a demonstration of his faith in God, because he knows God hears. He knows God's where he needs to turn. He's in distress and he needs what God has to offer. So really when he's doing this and he's using all of these phrases that imply, God, I need you to hear my prayer, it's really a demonstration of his faith.
When you brought up intensity, but also intention, right? Because this is the first thing he does when he gets up in the morning, is his intent is to put God first.
Yes.
Everything he does. So it's, you know, when we go through our days and, you know, you wake up in the morning, I'm tired, I go to work, but his intention is to give God glory first.
Yeah.
Go to him first.
Yeah.
But he's tired, but in the morning, your mind's clear.
Yes.
At any other time. Remember when I was in school, I'd get up and study for a test early in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he wanted his mind to be clear to speak to God and earnestly in the things that he wanted.
Yeah.
That's after I have a coffee.
After he's had his coffee. Okay, so those first 3 verses, he implores God to hear his prayer, offers sacrifice, and he sits back. Now what takes place in verses 4 through 6 is a declaration of how God hates evil. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. So 4, 5, and 6, there's that demonstration of how God despises the sinful, how He despises those who are evil. He hates evil. There's that vivid description there in those 3 verses, how God is offended because God is holy. God is holy.
Reminding God that He is.
Yes, and that's what part of the purpose of this kind of literature is. We repeat those things not to God necessarily. When we say, oh God, I know you're a God of whatever, it's to remind ourselves. And I think that's what, see, this would be, David writes it, and it's going to be run off on the copy machine and handed out to the people as they sing it on their way to the temple maybe. And they're going to be singing about God's greatness and God's power, and they're going to sing about what God has done for them in the past. And so I think that's part of the very character of what we've talked about Psalms being. Because we do that, don't we? We come, we worship, and we'll sing a song, God is so good. Well, God knows that. Remind me, God is so good. I think they are. I think that's a possibility. There seems to be little understanding of any commentator who would say, yes, this is definitely what's happening, but the hint seems to be that this is in the time of David still around, because David's obviously writing these, and they're dabbling in all kinds of idolatry during that time, yes. Yeah. Yeah. And whether that particular phrase is talking about anything to do with idol worship, we know we use that term bloodthirsty to talk about greedy and covetous and murderous and those kind of people as well.
What part of David's life do you think is before or after?
Before or after his sin? Is that what with Bathsheba? I'm not sure. There's no real.
Is this about him? Is he talking to himself?
Well, he begins by saying my. So yes, in the beginning, it's about him. I want you to hear my prayer, but my prayer is concerning the nation and wicked people. So yeah, he moves it from me, my mind, to them and the wickedness that I know that you hate. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. Verse 7, but I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in fear of you. That makes you think it's going to be one that's sung on their way to the temple, maybe? Or maybe getting ready to go to the temple. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me, and so on. Notice the conclusion, because we're out of time. Verse 12. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. Now he starts out pretty much lamenting difficulty, bloodthirsty, evil men, and then he closes it out by saying, God, you're it. You're the best. Your love, your righteousness, your power, it all is what helps me through the day. All right. Very good. Look at Psalm 10 through 12 for next week. Psalms 10 through 12. Appreciate your comments.